let's spend a little bit of time demystifying the naming and classification of all these microorganisms. We're going to run into some really complicated sounding names. In fact, nomenclature, or the language of naming, is much like learning an entirely new language. So keep in mind, unless you practice actually speaking it, you can't be proficient at the language. So it's ultimately important that you pronounce the names rather than slurring over them and pretending it doesn't really matter. If you speak the language, then you can understand the language more clearly. We all know that from learning our languages in middle school, right? So microbial nomenclature is the naming system of microorganisms. And we use this naming system to establish categories or taxa of organisms. And there comes the science of taxonomy. Now, the science of taxonomy is always active since the beginning of the time that we've been trying to classify living things. It originated over 250 years ago with the work of Carl von Linné, or Carolus Linnaeus. He needed to identify different organisms. You know how we could call a particular organism by its common name, like a horse. Well, a horse is pretty standard. A horse in the States is the same as a horse elsewhere, but it might have a different name elsewhere. However, if we use this Latin and Greek naming system, then we will all understand worldwide what a horse actually is. On the other side of the thing, in England, where I'm from, there are species of flowers that are called bluebells. There are also a species of flowers called bluebells here. However, they are entirely different plants. So the naming system was really important. The field of identification, we're simply discovering and recording the traits of organisms so that they can be sorted and named and classified, put into their different taxonomic groups. In this section, we'll learn a few general rules about the language in order to try and clear it up and make it a little easier for us to understand. But remember, always sound it out. They pretty much all go by the sound that the letters seem to spell. Now, there are a number of different levels of classification. You're probably fairly familiar with this, so I'll spend some time in a moment looking at this domain one, because that's probably a little new to you. However, the kingdom, phylum, or some people call it division, class, order, family, genus, and species are the levels of classification. They become less and less inclusive. That is, the domain contains many more organisms than the kingdom. So a domain has several kingdoms, and a kingdom has several phylums. Each phylum has fewer organisms than the kingdom itself. So now that we understand that, let's take a look at the condition of a human and then a protozoan species. When we look at this figure here, we can see that the human and these protists or protozoan species belong in the same domain, eukarya, but in different kingdoms. The human is in the kingdom Animalia, and this eventual protozoan, the paramecium, is going to belong in the kingdom Protista, which are single-celled eukaryotes. Once we work down to our next phylum, we are in the phylum Chordata. Chordata are all organisms that have chords in them. Now the phylum Ciliophora, they all have cilia or little hair-like structures around them. Beneath Chordata, there are many different classes. We are in the class Mammalia, and the paramecium are in the class Hymenostomes. As we move into the next subcategory, we'll see that we're in the order Primates, and then family Hominids, and the genus Homo, and species Sapiens. This is where we get to the naming, in the genus and species. So for the purposes of this class, the thing we're most interested in are the genus and species, because that's how we come up with our naming system. Again, von Linné was the guy that was in charge of this. Taxonomy is the science of living things, and von Linné decided to systematically classify things so that we would be using the same names for the same things worldwide. Every organism has two names, a binomial designation, right? This science of naming is called binomial nomenclature. So the two-named naming system. The way that we write these words is really important. Always, we're going to use this format. Now, at first glance, it might not look like any specific format, but you will notice that it's absolutely italicized. And the first name, the genus name, is capitalized. If you don't have the capacity to use italics, like if you were writing it in handwriting, you would use underlining. So the whole thing would be underlined, the genus name capitalized, the species name lowercase. This is really important, so make sure you write that down. Again, first name capitalized, species name not capitalized, all in italics or underlined. Now, all hierarchies are based on the judgments of scientists with certain expertise about that particular organism. So naturally, as we learn new techniques and things change, we notice that there's not really permanence to this hierarchical naming. For example, as we got more molecular techniques that enabled us to look at proteins and ribosomal RNA, we decided that even though some things looked very much alike, when we looked at the molecular level, they weren't really related much at all. And so those new techniques allowed us to reclassify things. We'll see a great example of that when we start looking at the classification of domains. Now, let's look at some great examples of this naming system. The actual names used are kind of interesting because there's a number of different reasons that they might be named in that way. Some of them are from shape. We'll get very used to naming things by their shape. For example, bacillus means rod-shaped. We'll get to more of that shortly. So we can name them by their shape, their color, diseases they cause, sometimes where they're found, or even the name of the scientist that discovered them. Here's some examples. Staphylococcus aureus. Staphule is a bunch of grapes. Coccus means berry-shaped, and aureus means golden. So these are a round-shaped organism that appear in bunches and have a golden color. How about Campylobacter jejuni? Campylos means curved. Bacterion, little rod. Jejunum is part of the intestine. So these are curved little rods that we find in the intestine. Or Giardia lamblia. Living in this environment, you're probably familiar with that. This is the Giardia we get from drinking from high mountain streams that are polluted by fecal matter from cattle. These are named for two scientists that were involved in their discovery. Alfred Giard, a French microbiologist, and then Victor Lambel, who's a Bohemian physician. So together we came up with Giardia lamblia. The IA is the Latin endings. Now, the hint here is you absolutely have to sound them out. So get to pronouncing. If you don't pronounce them and you don't speak them, remember, you don't really know the language. So as we move through these chapters, tell your dog about them, tell your boyfriend, your girlfriend, tell your plants about them. So long as you're speaking them, you'll have a much better grip on the language. So as I introduced before, the field of taxonomy is always alive. And one of the reasons is because it's subjective. Each expert in their particular area decides what groups particular organisms belong in. Let me show you an example of where we really changed the grouping of things based on an advent in technology with all the molecular techniques. Now, originally we just thought that there were animals and plants. But then in 1959, it was noted that things like fungi were different than animals and plants. And then there were protists. And then there were monarans. So let's take a look at that tree. Robert Whittaker presented this in 1959. That we have these monarans, which consist of the archaea and the bacteria, all these prokaryotic cells. And then from the monarans arose all these eukaryotes. And first, there's this big group of single-celled eukaryotes that we called protists. They are microbes also, but they're single-celled or very simple cellular conglomerates that we called protists. And then there are multicellular eukaryotes, plants, fungi, and animals that stemmed off of different regions within here. Now, really, not everything has changed. It doesn't mean like you can neglect looking at any of the old taxonomy because it's all going to change soon anyway. Just the way we look at it changed a little bit. Let's look at the tree of Carl Woese. He presented this in 1975, and it's only really just starting to make its way into textbooks. But he recognized using ribosomal analysis techniques, looking at the ribosomal RNA, so that these organisms that were in the Monera category, previously the bacteria and the archaea, actually had ribosomes that were very distinct from each other. In fact, the ribosomes of the archaeans were much more closely related to those of the eukaryotes. And so that sort of rearranged things. Ribosomes, you see, have been conserved. They don't change much in structure over time. And so when there is a distinct change, you can see non-relatedness because of this. Similarly, the analysis of protein structure and how it changes over time is a much better gauge of who belongs in which groups than simply looking at them. After all, some things have adapted to the same conditions and come up with the same solutions, even though they're unrelated. So, noting this difference in ribosomal structure, Woese proposed that there were 3 domains, even above the kingdom level. So those 3 domains are archaea, bacteria, and eukarya. Now, all the archaeans are prokaryotic cells, but they're distinct from each other. It's thought that the eukaryotes, like us, evolved from the archaean branch of prokaryotic cells. Either way, it's below the domain eukarya that we're going to see all of these familiar things, plants, animals, fungi, and protists. But the Monerans we're recognizing are a much more vast group, and thus they have become the domain bacteria and the domain archaea. Archaea being more closely related to eukaryotes than any of the bacteria. Now, who are the archaea? The archaeans are organisms that really love strange environments, like the extreme bacterias, really. They like the hydrothermal vents, so really hot and acidic, extreme places. So that brings us to the end of this chapter, but before we leave, let's have a quick concept check. Which of these is the correct scientific name for the common lab bacterium? So which one is written correctly? We just learned some rules about how you write these genus species names. What did it have to be? Well, none of them are underlined, but some are italicized. So which ones can we use? A is not italicized, and D is not italicized. So we can get rid of those. But which of B or C is the correct one? Now, it had to be a capitalized genus, lowercase species. So B is correct. We'll get C off the list.